for coming here today for this talk by Professor Mushtaq Khan, who in economic circles needs no introduction. Professor Khan is a professor of economics at SOAS. Before shifting to SOAS, he was faculty at the University of Cambridge. He's a lead thinker on industrial policy, institutions, and growth. And he has a lot of work and very seminal work on corruption and rent seeking during the economic transformation processes in different countries. So at SOAS, he heads the Anti-Corruption Evidence Research Consortium, which is really producing very original and pioneering work on feasible and high-impact anti-corruption strategies in countries where the rule of law is weak. So the argument in his work isn't that you look at how do you get to strong rule of law, but what are the strategies that you use in the transitional process when institutional capacity is weak and rule of law is weak. In addition to that, he's also heading this SOAS-Yale partnership called RENT, which is doing a lot of very interesting work in Nepal. And he headed the Governance and Growth Research Program, which conducted, again, original research in Bangladesh, Tanzania, India, and Thailand, really looking at the political economy of technological transformation and economic growth processes. He's written some seminal books. One book, particularly for the economists who haven't read it, which is worth reading, is Rent Seeking and Economic Development, Theory and Evidence, which he co-edited with Professor Jomo. And he also wrote a book which I think is not read enough, which was on the state formation in Palestine, which was some work that he did about a decade ago. I was kind of inspired to go into economics by Professor Khan, although he probably looks younger than me, but when I went to Corpus Christi to do my undergraduate at Oxford, Mushtaq was a junior research fellow, and he taught me development, and that was one of the courses that, for the misfortune of my students and colleagues, put me on the road to becoming an economist. And then I followed him because he went to Cambridge, and he was my PhD supervisor at Cambridge. During that time, it was a very interesting time because there was a lot of World Bank work. The big thing that needed to be explained at that point was the sudden catch-up of East Asian economies. So, the world was sort of captured with the need to explain how a set of developing countries, caught up with the growth in the developed world at a very fast pace. And the initial set of explanations that came out of the World Bank, with people like Bela Balasa and others, was basically an explanation based on liberal markets, that it was deregulation. It was really opening up. And then a set of scholarship started, and there were 2 or 3 hubs of that scholarship. One hub at that particular point was Cambridge, where Mushtaq was doing his work, and actually his PhD thesis gave phenomenal insights into that process, which challenged the notion that these processes were driven by purely market forces, or policies that basically brought about solely market forces, and really started to talk about the centrality of industrial policy in these transformations. And then there's been historical work also about the importance of industrial policy in the transformation of even economies like the US itself, which has come out of that corpus of work. The big challenge, of course, was that when you looked at the set of countries where industrial policy has been tried, and in some sense you could argue that even following liberal economic precepts is an industrial policy, but where what I'd call activist industrial policy was deployed, you get a set of countries that deploy industrial policies and can grow, and then a set of countries that get tied into stagnation. So the big question is, within these countries where the rule of law is weak, where state capacities are not very developed, where policy-making expertise is also nascent at times. How do you move on to different paths? What are the strategies that are there? And that's where I think, this set of work that Mushtaq has generated and a lot of his students have generated give us lots of insights. And one of the countries that this work has focused on is Bangladesh, though Mushtaq's work on East Asia, his PhD thesis compared Bangladesh to South Korea, actually. And then he did a lot of interesting work on Taiwan as a very different model from South Korea. But, sort of the focus today is going to be Bangladesh. And the reason I thought that would be an interesting focus is there's, in the past 4 years, every time anybody talks about the Pakistani economy, it's in comparison to Bangladesh's phenomenal transformation. And there's this curve that somebody generated, which is rather interesting, where if you look at sort of per capita GDP and you plot it from 1970 between Bangladesh and Pakistan, Bangladesh initially is going at a very flat rate. Pakistan has a kind of linear, shallow curve, and then at some point, there's an exponential catch-up that starts to happen, which reminds me every time I look at that curve of the Pakistan-England 1992 World Cup final, because that's exactly what Pakistan did. They had a flat curve to catch up with, sort of initially, in the New Zealand semi-final, and then they caught up and won the semi-final and then the final in the World Cup. So, but we really don't have insightful explanations. What I've heard, at least as an economist, I found very general. And they don't sort of situate the economic question in the politics question, because at the end of the day, basically how the politics around industrial policy plays out is very kind of fundamental to what you end up getting. There was a lovely piece that the late Sartaj Aziz wrote in a book that was edited by Anjum Naseem, our professor, in which he said that, if I had the Chinese polity, I would be all for state enterprises. But the trouble is that the Pakistani polity is not the Chinese polity. And when I start from that assumption, then perhaps the SOE move looks very differently. So what we are going to get is perhaps this tying of some notion of political economy with the economics of industrial policy transformations and get an insight into Bangladesh's transformation while doing that. So I'll just hand over the floor to Mushtaq. The way we'll do it is as a sort of a presentation for about 50 minutes to an hour, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Thank you, Ali. And thank you for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to come to Lahore. I've been here like a decade ago, and it's like coming home. So it's also very interesting to come from the East and talk to our Western brothers about what has happened. Like Ali said, a lot of these things don't fit the standard model, neither the standard market model nor the standard industrial policy model. And both models fail to explain what actually has been happening in the developing world. So let me begin with some background. Ali's already alluded to it. In 1971, East Pakistan stroke Bangladesh had almost zero manufacturing capacity, zero. It had nothing. And whatever it had was not locally owned. It was owned by West Pakistanis, many of whom left. There were a handful of East Pakistani capitalists who had industries at that time, and these were immediately nationalized by the Awami League government, and they also got destroyed very rapidly because they were nationalized. So this was a second partition where East Bengal lost. Because the first partition in 47, Bengal was one of the most industrialized parts of India, Bengal Presidency and Bombay Presidency. But when Bengal was partitioned, all of the industry happened to be on the Hooghly belt near Calcutta, and East Bengal got nothing. So we lost industry then. And then in 71 again, when Pakistan got partitioned, East Pakistan had nothing, and what was left was rapidly destructured. From that very unpropitious beginning, and lots of people, including most Bangladeshis, thought this country can't last. It's going to crater. Kissinger said very famously, it's a basket case. Well, today, the share of manufacturing in GDP in Bangladesh is 18.5%. It's even higher than India's 13.1% and much higher than Pakistan's 11.5%. So there's been a dramatic kind of increase in the very thing that East Pakistanis were supposed to be extremely bad at doing, which is manufacturing. And I'm not going to give other figures of growth of per capita incomes and so on. I think people know that. I'm going to try and explain how this happened. And how this happened was actually, in some way, a series of accidents which allowed people to discover industrial policy strategies that worked. And the growth of this growth was not driven by the old industries like jute and so on, which sugar, metals. It was driven by completely new sectors for Bangladesh. Garments, textiles, and pharmaceuticals are the three main drivers, but there are also other small industrial sectors now developing. The critical thing is that these sectors became globally competitive. They did not require lots of protection and so on. They started exporting, and it's that export-driven growth which is the secret. And the success of this new growth was not based on old industrial policy. And I think this is what Ali was saying as he started, that old-style industrial policy, which is basically protecting your industries, giving them subsidies, giving them low-interest credit, and hoping that they will become productive, that has not worked well anywhere in South Asia, but did work very well in East Asia. So one of the puzzles is, why did it not work in South Asia and work in East Asia? I will touch on that. But more importantly, what I want to touch on is what did work in South Asia. And very interestingly, I don't have time to go into it, some of the things that happened in Bangladesh were very similar to the industrial policy that worked in India. So if you look at the Indian auto industry, its structure of incentive very similar to what was going on in Bangladesh, but accidentally, no one was copying anyone. So these new types of industrial policies work because they solved two problems simultaneously. The first was that they created credible incentives to achieve competitiveness in these new sectors. Okay, so this is what industrial policy is supposed to be. But they satisfied a second condition, which most industrial policies do not satisfy, that the way the policy resources were given could not be captured by the capitalists without delivering results. Now, this is where most industrial policy fails, right? So you try to solve some problem with some policy resources, the policy resources then get captured, and then nothing happens. So the question is, how did they do this? And let me go through those two things a little bit in detail, and then I'll give some case studies. I'll go to the garments industry and the pharmaceutical industry in Bangladesh. So the first question is, industrial policy fails because often it doesn't even address the most important reason why your industry is not competitive. Now, you might think this is self-evident, but it's not self-evident. There are multiple reasons why industry is not competitive in a particular sector. So is the primary problem one of financing, that people can't get financing or the interest rate is too high? Is the problem one of skills, that your workers are not skilled, they need to have skills training? Is the problem policy predictability, that the policy keeps changing? All of these things are important. But actually, if you look at the sectors that grew in South Asia, whether, Bangladesh's garments, textiles, pharmaceuticals, Indian auto, Indian pharma, none of that was preceded by any dramatic change in financing. It wasn't preceded by any dramatic skills programs. It wasn't preceded by any big change in the politics of policy and policy stability. So these are important, but this is not what triggered the growth. There is another problem which people often ignore, and that is that the firm itself has very low productivity, even if you give it the same machines and the same skilled workers as your competitor. The cross-country evidence is very clear that low productivity and low competitiveness, therefore, is the fundamental problem. You can give someone the same machines as a factory in China. Your workers might have the same skills as a factory in China, but your productivity might be 1/10. Now, what is going on here is actually at the heart of industrial policy. So what is going on here? Here are some kind of examples of what this means. So lots of people have studied it, but these studies are very difficult to do, but there are studies. So in this very early study, and this is how this, Sutton was one of the pioneers of this kind of study. He looked at Indian machine tool manufacturers in the same country with the same technology and the same machines. The productivity of the more productive to the less productive differed by a factor of 6. Now just get that into your head, how big that is. That's 600%, right? So how can almost the same machines, and the best Indian factories were 50% of the productivity of the worst international competitor. Can you imagine the difference in productivity? Now, so developing countries can compete because their wage differential compensates for this to some extent, right? But if your productivity is 1/6, your wage has to be lower than 1/6 to have the same unit cost. That's quite tough, right? In cotton spinning, in India, around the early 2000s, using identical machine as a US company, Indian cotton spinning productivity was 7.4 times. I mean, US productivity was 7.4 times greater. So if India is 100, that's 740. That's a 640% difference with the same machines. I think people really often don't get the scale of the difference here, right? So your wages in India would have to be 1/10 of the US, which it is, which is why they're competitive. But you're using wages to compensate for massive differences in productivity. Even in 1990, if you compare the productivity of Indian textile workers with US workers of 1959, that is 20 years before, it was still 25%. Now, so the machines are the same. You do not need a PhD to operate a spinning mill, right? What kind of skills do you need? Why does India not have it? And India, by the way, is a successful textile country. If you did this calculation in Nigeria or Tanzania, it would be off the scale, the productivity difference. India can compete because the wage differential compensates for the productivity difference, right? This is the heart of also a lot of my research. You cannot explain these productivity differences with skills or machines. It's actually something much more nebulous called organizational capabilities. It's how you organize your factory and how you organize the value chain from the factory to other bits of the value chain. This is the critical thing, because without this, you cannot explain these big differences in productivity. So what are these organizational capabilities? Organizational capabilities are things that determine the speed of throughput of material through your factory. How rapidly is your production line moving? How good is your quality control? How good is your inventory management? How good is your order management? And you might think, this is second order, this is less important. I have a very good new machine, this is more important. Actually, the machine is the least important, is the organization. So think about what this means, right? If you don't have good quality control, you're in a garments factory, your production line is moving. Somewhere, someone hasn't picked up that one worker is stitching the buttons wrong. At the end of the day, you have a stock lot of a whole day's of production which you have to throw away. So what is productivity? Productivity is output divided by input, right? So if you've thrown away a lot of your product because one small quality control mistake happened, your productivity collapses. Order management, right? How do you sequence your production line with the next order If you get it wrong, your factory is lying idle for 5 days. Those 5 days you're not producing anything because the order management has failed, etc. Inventory management. One machine breaks down, you don't have that specific spare part, the whole factory closes down, your output drops, productivity drops. This is it. The Indian spinning mill is, the workers are working extremely hard, but they cannot compensate for the inefficiency of the organization. So it's like you take, you take a couple, 3 or 4 PhDs, and you take them to a developing country university, not LUMS, but university which is not well organized. They're not going to make any difference, right? Because the organization will kill it. People do not understand the importance of organization. I can't stress it enough. If you ask me, what is the difference between a less developed and a more developed country? It's not that the more developed country has more capital or more skills or more education. The more developed country has more organizational capabilities. Because all of the things education, why are we remaining poor in education? Is because we cannot organize education. We are spending a lot of money in education, but you're not getting the output. Why aren't we getting... So all of the things that you think are the proximate causes of development are actually due to organizational failures. So a more advanced country just has better organized units, better organized firms, better organized universities, better organized hospitals. Everything else you can buy. The organization you cannot buy. The organization is your society and how it gels together. So organizational capabilities are a series of routines. How people within an organization do their jobs, those routines need to connect up with other people's routines, and the whole thing has to be an organic whole. It's the most difficult thing to achieve, as anyone who has tried to reform a university will know, right? The most difficult thing is to organize the routine so that everything works seamlessly. And these capabilities are built up gradually, so over time, a more advanced country has very sophisticated organizations, has very sophisticated routines, and the developing, catching up country has to find some way of matching that organizational capability, otherwise its productivity will be too low, and however low your wages, you're not going to be able to compete. Wages are not the way to compete. Productivity is the way to compete. And productivity is not based on machines, primarily it is based on organization. That's my starting point. I'm not talking about, if you're fabricating chips, that's a different story, right? I'm talking about everyday manufacturing. Their organization is the main constraint. So if you want to catch up, you have to build up your organizational capabilities and reduce the productivity difference to less than the wage difference, right? Then you suddenly become competitive. And how do you build up the organizational capabilities? What is the only way you can do it is observation. You go and see how a better factory works. Experimentation, because you can't copy everything from that factory. You have to adapt it to your conditions. So you're observing, you're adapting, and then you're routinizing it through practice. The whole organization starts routinizing that practice. This is what is called learning by doing, right? Learning by doing is required because just putting the factory with machines and workers isn't going to work. You need to get that routines into that production process, whether it's agriculture, into whatever it is. Okay. So that period of learning by doing, by definition, is loss-making compared to your competitor. It's loss-making because you have a higher unit cost, you can't sell, you're going to make a loss. That's where industrial policy comes in. Somebody has to help with that loss financing. In theory, you could imagine an entrepreneur saying, okay, I will take the whole risk and do this on my own, and then I will get the return. But that is subject to massive market failures. The risk is too high, the reward is not that high. Some social sharing of that risk-reward equation has to happen. And that is why industrial policy is important in developing countries, is to support this learning period using different incentives, protection, and subsidies. And here is the problem, the second failure. The second failure is as soon as you start doing that, that gets captured. So you give a company a subsidy, you give it a tax break, but why should the company work so hard to raise its productivity, which is a lot of hard work, because you have to continuously work to change, experiment, when the prize at the end of it is you lose your subsidy. No. So actually, industrial policy has very adverse incentives. You are given some money and you're told you have to become productive, and once you become productive, we will take that away and give it to someone else. That's what the South Koreans did. Yeah? But why would you want to do that? If you are a normal human being, you will say this is a bad idea. So the natural response is to try and maintain the subsidy permanently. And if you're an average industrialist, you have friends in the bureaucracy, friends in politics, you pay political contributions to parties, you might pay a few bribes, you have friends in the bank. Basically, you work to ensure that the subsidy doesn't go, and as long as the subsidy doesn't go, you don't have the hard work of raising your productivity, and then you swim in the open market competing with all these other guys. No one wants to do that. Everyone wants to be protected and safe, and I'm just going to do what I did yesterday, and the money will come like yesterday. That's the end of industrial policy. And that's where I think all South Asian countries failed, and East Asian countries worked. But East Asian countries worked because they had what I call a very unique political settlement. And the political settlement is a distribution of power in society. And I'm going to very briefly summarize what that is. And that political settlement in East Asia basically meant that when the top in society, when the planning commission or when the president wanted to do something, nobody else could block it. There were no coalitions that the capitalists could form with other factions within the party, within the politics, within the bureaucracy that would protect that capitalist for some money they were paying. The top could override resistance from the bottom. This configuration of power is very unique. There are only very few countries which have it. South Korea, Taiwan, China to some extent. Okay? So in those conditions, you could provide subsidies and you could set targets, and if the firm did not meet the target, you could withdraw the subsidy. No one could stop you from withdrawing the subsidy. The firm could not find some allies somewhere else which would resist your attempt to withdraw the subsidy. You did not work, you were bankrupt, they would take your firm and give it to some other capitalist. So not only did you lose your subsidy, you might lose your firm. The firm might be transferred from one chaebol to another chaebol, one business to another business. That forced high levels of effort. As soon as the capitalist knows that if I don't succeed, I will lose not only my subsidy but my firm, they wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and start experimenting. How do I improve my organization? How do I meet my export target? How do I raise my productivity? Right? So it's not surprising. It's very easy to explain once you understand the power structure. But this is exactly the power structure that our countries do not have. So the problem is there are very few societies which have it, but that model of industrial policy, import protection, export subsidies, low credit, banking, this and that, is the model of industrial policy that everybody tries to follow. Without understanding, they cannot implement it. And the result is pretty much disaster. You have huge non-performing loans in banks, customers are buying expensive products because of high tariff protection. You know, your cars are second-class cars, but they're very expensive, then they'll never improve, they will never become productive. You know, so consumers are paying the price, the productivity is not going up, it's a loss on every side. So that's what we know very well. The infant industries didn't grow up. Now what happened in the 1980s, one of the things that happened while partition and 71 was extremely destructive for Bangladesh, there were some good sides to it as well. The good side was that the old elites and the old power structures were completely smashed. New people could come up and you could make new arrangements. right? This political opening up is very important, I think.
So, I mean, the old elites, if they captured all the resources, it becomes
Becomes very difficult to find any new solutions. So you could try out lots of experiments in Bangladesh in the 1980s, which may be more difficult in Bangladesh today, because Bangladesh today, again, elites have captured things. Right? So you don't find such experimentation happening today in Bangladesh, and I'm hoping for something to shake it up again. Right? But you need experimentation, and that's very difficult to do if you have elite capture. So the new industrial policy that emerged changed the sequence of events. Instead of saying we will give you subsidies in advance and then you use it to raise your productivity, it said, not consciously, but by experiment, it emerged, you will have a lot of profits after you become competitive, and the industrial policy assures you of that. The profit will be even higher than normal, because the profit will pay for your investment in learning. Right? So you are flipping the ex-ante subsidy to an ex-post subsidy. The second thing that happened is that now the monitoring of this subsidy and who is going to withdraw it and so on is no longer happening from above. It's no longer a vertical enforcement, and this is really important. It's not enforcement from above, it becomes much more horizontal enforcement with the actors themselves pulling and pushing each other to make sure that it'll become clearer when I explain this later on. And so this model of more horizontal checks and more ex-post rewards as opposed to ex-ante rewards was the configuration that emerged, both in the garments industry, but also in the pharmaceutical industry. And as I said earlier, if you look at what made the Indian auto industry take off, exactly the same thing, right? So what was the problem? The problem was this: the normal way that economists think about enforcement, right? So you have a subsidy recipient and I'm trying to enforce something. So the person at the top is the kind of policymaker or the bank or the planning agency or the president or whoever. And they are giving subsidies to different people, the agents, these could be firms. And your success of this enforcement depends on the principal being able to discipline the agent, right? That if you are not performing, I can take it back. And standard economic theory says that this can be disrupted by three things, right? One is transparency, that the agent is hiding things and you're not seeing it. So you have to have more transparency and more revelation of what But this is very easy to fix because you can set export targets which are very easy to observe and very hard to hide. Or it could be accountability, that you have detected the failure, but you can't punish this person enough. They somehow managed to get away, or the accountability system is not clear. And the third is the technical capacities of bureaucrats, that they don't know how to operate the system, they don't know how to monitor, they don't know how to withdraw support. But actually, this doesn't explain what happened. Because in South Asia, even when poor performance was transparent, this company is a dead company. It's not hiding anything, right? It's low productivity, loss-making, can't repay its debts. What are you hiding? It's totally transparent. The accountability procedures are all there. Bankruptcy, closing it down, withdrawing the subsidies, all there. Formally, all these procedures are there. The accountability mechanisms are there. And bureaucrats are not stupid. Not in Pakistan, not in India, not in Bangladesh. They don't need more computers to do this stuff. The problem is that they don't have the power to do this stuff. You might know that something is going on, but you can't do it. And here is the issue. It's not even that the bureaucrats and politicians of East Asia were not corrupt. They were highly corrupt. And this is my PhD thesis that Ali referred to. East Asian bureaucrats or Chinese bureaucrats in the 1980s were hugely corrupt. But it didn't stop them from disciplining capitalists because they easily figured out that the more productive capitalist will give me even bigger bribes. Why should I support an uncompetitive, failing capitalist and get small bribes when I can support a more competitive and more successful capitalist and transfer the support, and I will get a bigger price. This is not rocket science, right? So you don't even need to end corruption to have disciplining. Actually, corruption creates very strong incentives for disciplining because they are going to go after the dead weight and go for the more productive people. But it doesn't happen. They keep on supporting the failed, inefficient, low productivity people. So something more complicated is going on. And here is where the political settlements analysis comes in. So give me just a little bit of leeway. I'll have 2 slides, then I'll come to the interesting story of what happened in Bangladesh. So the whole way we think in economics and institutional economics of enforcement, I think is wrong. It's wrong because we focus on the vertical, right? But actually in every context, the vertical enforcement is working because behind it is a lot of horizontal enforcement that we are ignoring. You have to look at the horizontal pressures to understand why the vertical is working or not working. When it works, it's because of the horizontal. When it doesn't work, it's also because of the horizontal. And that horizontal depends on the power and the capabilities and the interests of all these actors who are around that policy flow. And this configuration of power, capabilities, and interests is very different in East Asia compared to South Asia. And also, of course, different within South Asia, but let's keep it at a very broad level. And one way I find it very easy to explain to people is think of the paradox of queues. Why do people stand in line in a queue? Now, is it the case that in some countries people just don't stand in line in queues and in other countries people stand in line in queues? Is it culture? Is it schooling? Well, I'll tell you a story which is from Bangladesh, but it might be equally applicable to Pakistan. I'm sure it is. So I live in a part of Dhaka called Gulshan, which is prosperous. If you go catch a bus in Gulshan, everyone is standing in line. You will never find a line that is broken. But if you go to an outskirt part of Dhaka, let's say Mirpur, in Mirpur, if you want to get into a bus, no one is standing in line. In fact, the same people who are standing in line in Gulshan will not be standing in line in Mirpur. Okay? So what is happening? Is it that the police are more effective in Gulshan? Are there more CCTV cameras? Is there more vertical enforcement? No. It's just that the people who are standing in line in Gulshan are unconsciously, and we do it all the time, we are assessing the power and interests of other people in the line. We in developing countries, we do it unconsciously. We know that if I break this line, someone will pull me back. So I don't break this line. But the same person, when they go to another place, they look at the situation and they say, and others, and some powerful people are already breaking the line and no one is pulling them back. There's no horizontal check. And I'm a powerful person, or I think I am. So I say, those guys are getting in. If I don't get in, I will never get into the bus. So I also break the line. And then the line breaks down. What is this example telling you? Is that rule following, 95% is based on the horizontal checks. 5% might be based on the vertical check. And how the vertical check works will depend on the horizontal check. So for example, going back to my example, if in Gulshan a fight breaks out, someone is pulled back and they go and hit the other person on the face and the police come, what will happen is that all the people in this line will give the right evidence and the police will catch the right person and there is no way they can get out of it. This same police, when they go to Mirpur and a fight breaks out, they will pick up the poor person and everyone will say, just take this guy. He was the one who was making the trouble. And the police will do that. And no amount of training and computers and technical assistance will make the police behave differently. Right? Because their horizontal check is different. So my point is, if you understand the horizontal power, you begin to understand why rules are broken and why rules are enforced and how the enforcers behave themselves. So this is in a very brief way, this is the political settlements analysis. It's the distribution of power. And once you look at the distribution of power, you're embedding your vertical monitoring in those horizontal relationships. So actually, I'll just pass over this because these are definitions of power, capabilities, and interests, which not really required. I mean, maybe I just quickly go through it. So what is important is this diagram. In this diagram, this is what we always look at, the vertical enforcement. But actually, the vertical enforcement cannot be understood without all the other horizontal checks on the enforcer and the enforced. The enforcer and the enforced are not sitting in a vacuum, they're sitting in a society. There's a lot of pressure on the police, there's a lot of pressure on the bank, there's a lot of pressure on the prime minister, and there's a lot of pressure on the firms. So, in a rule-following society, when you have a rule of law, what happens when you have a rule of law? In a rule of law means that you're in a society where if you violate a rule and you're detected, the probability of punishment is the same whoever you are. It's not perfect, no country is a full rule of law, but there are countries close to the rule of law, which is why Trump was convicted, right? So, what is happening in a rule of law country is that both the principal and the agent are under pressure from a lot of horizontal actors who want rules to be enforced in their own interest. What kinds of organizations want rules to be enforced in their own interest? Are highly productive organizations. A productive organization is producing value. If you're a good football player, you want to be in a team that follows the rules. If you're a good musician, you want to be in an orchestra that follows rules. If you're a business which has high organizational capabilities, you want to have lots of rules to keep your organization together, and you want to deal with other organizations following rules. But if you're a rubbish football player, you want to be in a football team that doesn't follow the rules. If you're a rubbish doctor, you want to be in a hospital where no one is following rules and you survive, and same with the companies. So, in a rule of law country, everyone as an individual wants to break the rules. I want to take the subsidy and not repay it. But once I am caught, all the other businesses will say this guy has to be punished. Right? Because we need to bring back the rules, otherwise our businesses will collapse, our interests will collapse. So the violating agent is under pressure from other actors, and the principal is under pressure from other actors to enforce. So whether they like it or not, they enforce. I hope you are getting the gist of this, right? So enforcement is not an individual decision that I will enforce or not. Do I have the capacity? Do I have the computers? Do I have the skills? It's about how others are pressuring you. Now, in the East Asian countries, in the developmental states, you don't have a rule of law because you don't have a general rule of law. But what you have is very strong top-down enforcement because nobody can stop the principle. The configuration of power is such. No one stops the principle when the principle goes after the non-performing agent. The non-performing agent cannot form a coalition to protect themselves. This will take, too much time to explain, but this is my research, right? So I look at how that configuration of power allows the principles in South Korea, China to enforce, and no one can stop them. What is of interest to us now is our kinds of countries where the horizontal actors actually block enforcement, right? So we are neither rule of law, nor are we developmental states. We are what I call competitive clientelist states or vulnerable authoritarian states or some fragmented distribution of power. So here what happens is that the agent who is violating, not paying subsidies or not paying taxes or whatever, is not under pressure from other actors when they're detected. Nobody cares because they're all violating. Following rules is not part of their business model. So when that agent is detected, other firms are not saying, we are not going to transact with you, we insist that you are punished. They're not saying that. And the principal who tries to punish them might be removed. Because all the horizontal actors around the principal are saying, this chap is our friend, how can you put pressure on him? That person is giving us money or having relationships with us. So actually, the principal, even if they try to enforce, will be blocked, will be removed. So we neither have a rule of law nor we have a developmental state. This is the reality. So what kind of industrial policy or what kinds of anything will work here? It's not that nothing works. Remember, people in Gulshan are standing in lines. It's not that nothing works. Some things are working. We need to understand what works and we need to build on that. If you first try to become a developmental state, it's a 500-year project. You have to start working on what works and build that. So effective enforcement in this context requires finding strategies that create horizontal pressure out of the self-interest of those actors that they will want that rule to be enforced. If you can find that strategy, then even in this messy political situation, messy political economy, you will have success. Because you will have that transformation of inputs into outputs that you require for your industrial policy. Now we come to the case studies. Okay? How did the garments industry emerge? And it emerged out of a series of accidents and experiments and so on, but ultimately, an industrial policy emerged that was self-enforcing horizontally and that financed that learning, the transfer of organizational capabilities. Okay? And the trigger for this was an accident. The trigger for this was an accident given to us by our American friends, which is the MFA of 1974. The MFA of 1974 was to protect American textile and garments industry by putting quotas on established garments exporters. Many of you probably know this, right? And to sell this to the international trade, I think it was GATT at that time, to sell it, the Americans offered this proposition that we will protect our industry with quotas, but if you're an LDC, you will not have quotas. Okay? So it was like they were being very kind to the poor developing world, knowing full well that LDCs could possibly not export because they don't have any organizational capabilities. And in fact, no LDC did. Bangladesh was the only big beneficiary, and the other beneficiaries didn't last very long. But Bangladesh was a big beneficiary because it used this opportunity to create those organizational capabilities. So how did it do that? It did that with a very specific deal. South Korea was locked out of the US market because they were quota bound. They couldn't export. They were looking for partners in developing countries who could begin to make shirts of the quality that you could export to the US at a price that was competitive because they wanted to sell their fabrics to this company. The only way they could sell their fabrics was through having a partner in a LDC who could then export to the US. But the only way you could do that was if your LDC partner could match the price and the quality that the South Koreans were selling, because that's what the US market wanted. So the MFA created an opportunity, but it didn't solve the problem. The problem was solved with a specific agreement, and that agreement was backed by a state policy, and that state policy allowed this agreement to happen, but the role of the state was now much smaller. The state was not giving subsidies and managing subsidies. It was managing a form of payment that would allow this organizational capability to be transferred. And this was the Desh Devu agreement. Okay? And it was an agreement through which Devu invested in the transfer of organizational capabilities and got paid from the exports, and that payment structure was guaranteed by the government. Because at that time, imagine, Bangladesh had no rule of law, nothing. Who would believe it? So that required a strong support from the top saying this will happen. That's all they did. The main thing was that the policy targeted a domestic company, and this is really important. The growth did not start with FDI. And the fact that the domestically owned company was at the heart of this organizational transfer becomes important for what I'm going to say later, which was the rapid imitation and spillover of this initial experiment. The transfer of knowledge was subsidized by Daewoo, but it was not a normal investment. Daewoo wasn't going in and saying, let's invest in this Bangladeshi company because we are nice people and they will export and then we will. No. Daewoo wanted its pound of flesh. It wanted a massive super profit return for transferring this organizational knowledge to the Bangladeshi company. And this was the compensation for the risk in the investment. This is what industrial policy is, right? It's not a normal market transaction. If it was a normal market transaction, it would happen everywhere. It's not happening, right? Because it's too risky. So someone has to give a supermarket return, that's the industrial policy, to allow this knowledge to be transferred. So the monitoring then becomes completely horizontal. Desh and Daewoo monitor each other, right? And the role of the public principal is now simply limited to enforcing that contract between the horizontal parties, not a vertical contract of public money going in which has to be withdrawn. So this is the circular argument. So Desh invests its resources, it sets up the factory. Daewoo then invests in building the organizational capability of this firm to South Korean standards. Once Desh becomes competitive and it starts exporting, Desh transfers a massive payoff to Daewoo. That payoff to Daewoo is their risk capital being refunded. They are taking a risk and they're getting a massive payoff. And the horizontal checking is between these two characters. The role of the state is simply to enforce this contract and to guarantee it. So the president of Bangladesh at that time was a general called Ziaur Rahman. He picked up the phone to Daewoo and said, I guarantee it. You are going to get your money. And then they did some small things like setting up a bonded warehouse and back-to-back LCs. I don't want to go into that, but those were second-order things. The main thing is the scale of the investment. They took 130 Bangladeshis to Busan. They stayed there to learn all these details about how to run the organization. Their payoff was an 8% royalty on exports for a certain number of years. Now, 8% in a garments industry is massive. Then the margins in garments exports are 1, 2, 3%, right? Daewoo wanted 8%, but they could get it because of the MFA rent. The MFA rent was that MFA had raised prices in the US market by having the quotas. That rising of prices in the US market was what they wanted because that protected the US producers. But if Bangladesh could produce at the South Korean price, that extra margin was the rent. I hope you're getting there. Yeah? And what they did was they told the South Koreans that entire margin goes to you. It's not even going to touch Bangladesh. In a capital-starved, foreign exchange-starved country, to say that 8% of our sales is not even going to come to Bangladesh, it's going to go straight to South Korea, that was the risk Bangladesh took. Right? The South Koreans got their pound of flesh. Bangladesh said, okay, we write this off. We just want the South Korean level of profit. We don't want the rent. So this complex arrangement comes together, and the industrial policy here is now radically different from the past. It has nothing to do with if the government has given Desh a subsidy and say, we are giving you the subsidy, now become like South Korea, they would still be getting the subsidy. Right? They would not become like South Korea. But here, magic happened. The magic was that neither side could capture a subsidy with any kind of political wheeling and dealing because there was no subsidy. But both sides would get very high returns if the organizational capability was learned. They would get that 8% and the Bangladeshis would get massive export orders. Okay. Let me come to the results. The results were, for a country which people said, never ever is a Bengali going to manufacture anything. Desh grew at 100% a year. They came back in 4 months. The training period was 2 years because they thought it would take 2 years to train these people. Because they had every incentive to learn, they wouldn't make money till they came back. they actually learned everything that they needed to learn in 4 months. Of these 130 managers, 115 set up their own factories in 2 years. And within a few years, there were 4,000 firms. Okay? At the heart of this was imitation. If the technology was not possible to imitate, this would not have happened. So a really important part of any developing country industrial policy is that it must be replicable. And the garments industry and the way, so what they learned, they adapted to Bangladeshi conditions, they set up Desh, and then they went off and set up their own companies on that model that works. And here is a really important thing, Desh did not stop them doing it. Contrary to economists like Hausman and Roderick, who say the first mover is always scared that other people will copy them, the reality is that's not the case. Desh did not stop them because Desh realized that actually clustering would bring even more business. And that clustering is extremely important for having an industrial growth strategy, right? So Desh actually encouraged people to go and set up their own factories, whereas Hausman and Roderick say, actually you need to compensate people, the first mover needs to be compensated because they are taking all the risk. It's not actually true. MFA was only the triggering factor. In a couple of years, Bangladesh had quotas imposed on it by the US, and it lost the MFA thing, but it didn't matter anymore. And by the 2000s, Bangladesh became the second biggest garments exporter. Behind that, there were backward linkages in textiles. And these garments factories began to go into spinning, weaving, and so on and so on. And that was now very successful because these garments manufacturers, and there were now like 4,000 of them, they knew organization, so they knew how to learn the organizational knowledge to make the spinning and the fabrics and the dyeing and so on, and they knew where to get this knowledge, right? So that seamlessly you have the backward linkages. This is also a very interesting part of Bangladesh's success story, that the textile and the garments are not separate industries with competing interests. The textile industry in Bangladesh is backward linked to the garments industry. Right? Now, so if you say a country like Ethiopia, if the garments industry wants cheap fabrics, that's against the interests of the textile industry because the textile industry wants to sell expensive fabrics. But because of the backward linkage here, the garments industry sets up its textile factory, there is no conflict of interest anymore. Right? And as a result, domestic value added in exports is now 90%, even though Bangladesh produces no cotton and has no synthetic fiber industry, unlike Pakistan, which has a cotton industry. So all of this value added is really coming from backward linkages. The downside, Bangladesh is excessively reliant on the garments industry and the textile industry. But what this example shows is that a small, tiny capability development experiment can have massive spillover effects. And therefore, one lesson is you need to try lots of these things. Right? You don't need to wait for one big national industrial policy and that will never be implemented and will be captured. But you need to try lots of experiments about how you can transfer organizational capabilities without being captured. I'll quickly go through the pharmaceutical industry, 10 minutes. This is another very interesting success story. Less known, but actually rapidly growing in Bangladesh now. Again, in the 1980s, the market was dominated by multinational companies. Multinationals had 75% of the domestic market, and they mostly produced inessential drugs, cough syrups and vitamins and this kind of stuff. This policy was driven again by a really interesting accident, by a very charismatic kind of doctor called Dr. Zafrullah Chaudhary, who was a social activist. Yeah? And he had tremendous legitimacy in Bangladesh because he was, like many of these people, he was part of the liberation struggle. And as a doctor, he set up a clinic treating wounded people who were being wounded in the conflict. Okay, he's completely anti-Awami League person, but he was part of the freedom struggle. His aim in Bangladesh was to set up a Chinese-style
People's health clinics, barefoot doctors.
And he was against the multinationals and wanted them out. And he came up with the national drugs policy in 1982 under his leadership. And the national drugs policy was the trigger for the big industrialization in the pharma sector. Again, the intention was not industrial policy, the intention was here something else. But the outcome was an industrial policy. Because what it did was it created very strong incentives for domestic investment in the pharmaceutical industry and domestic catching up of organizational capabilities to make that pharmaceutical industry competitive. So how did it happen? It happened because Zafrullah Chaudhry's drugs policy, which was passed by the Ershad government, declared 150 essential drugs as essential drugs, right? So antibiotics and blood pressure medicine, so kind of essential drugs. And then they said that the prices of these essential drugs will be set on a cost-plus basis. Drugs in developing countries, we are talking about generics, right? The APIs are globally available. So the API is very cheap. API is the active pharmaceutical ingredient. That is the base of the medicine, right? So the pharmaceutical industry began in Bangladesh basically by buying the API and producing the tablets, syrups, and packaging it. It was essentially a packaging industry initially. So these APIs are commodities available in the global market, and the government said if this is available on the global market, it should be sold at a cost-plus basis. The cost of the API is extremely small compared to the price of the medicine. So now the government has a formula. It set the price of all these 150 medicines on the basis of the price of the API, the price of the packaging, and a profit markup. Fixed by government, you can't sell outside it. And it also said that 60%, well, I'll come to that. Now, this profit that they added was extremely high for domestic producers, but it was too low for the MNCs. The MNCs were used to operating on very, very, very high profit margins. They had big air-conditioned, multi-story buildings with GlaxoSmithKline written on it and armies of SUVs and marketing agents and, so they could not operate without profit margins of thousands of percent, literally thousands of percent. And the drugs policy, as I said, also required that 60% of what every manufacturer produces has to be essential medicines, not cough syrups, not vitamins. You have to produce the antibiotics. Result? MNCs left. Everybody said, this is a terrible, Glaxo is leaving Bangladesh, these MNCs are leaving Bangladesh, it will be a disaster. Actually, it was the best thing that could have happened. The paradoxical result was, so this is a new kind of industrial policy. By reducing prices, you actually incentivize your domestic producers. Normally, people think of industrial policy as that I have to raise prices, right, to protect my... But if your market is captured by very high profit foreign companies, you can force them out by reducing prices, and that creates space for your domestic companies. So it's again, very, very novel industrial policy. So just to see it diagrammatically, in the early 1980s, when MNCs dominated the market, the cost of production is that little bit at the bottom. The price is high, and all of this is profit. The cost of an API of a 10 taka medicine is probably not even 1 taka. Everything else is profit. That profit is used for marketing, dividends, big offices, and overpaid staff. What the drug policy did is the cost of production was allowed to be higher because it was known that the multinationals will have economies of scale, they have good manufacturing practices, Newcomers don't have it. So you look at it as a cost plus, you add a surplus as profit, but now the price is way below what the MNCs are used to. So reducing the price actually exited the MNCs. They could not sell at this price. They did not want to sell at this price. And what happened now is that local manufacturers jumped into the market. They jumped into the market because this profit was very good for them. And without the marketing expenditure of the multinationals, they could sell. If the multinationals were there, they couldn't sell because the multinational marketing would have thrown them out. The multinational would say, our medicines are better, our medicines are this and that, and advertising, and the local manufacturer would not be able to compete because that surplus is used basically for marketing. And then over time, these people began to invest in good manufacturing practices and productivity and so on, and reduce their cost of production further, and over time prices grew, and this was the growth of the manufacturing in pharmaceuticals. So again, a completely non-standard way of thinking about industrial policy, creating incentives for domestic producers to raise their productivity with the promise that if you raise your productivity, you will make massive profits, but we don't give you the money in advance. You raise your competitiveness, you raise your quality, you raise your GMP, right? If you do that, you will make a lot of money. We will create the conditions for that by forcing the multinationals out, by reducing the price. That was the industrial policy. This is industrial policy, but it's not what we think of as industrial policy, right? So the first mover was GK, Ganashastro Kendra, the People's Health Center. They began manufacturing a whole range of essential medicines immediately. But it was followed by a growing number of private sector companies who saw the opportunity. They invested their own money, set up their own production processes, and they invested in learning organization of pharmaceutical industry. They went to India, they went to European countries, they brought in the technical expertise, teach us good manufacturing practices. Why? Because they knew that they had to protect their brand name in this growing market. The rewards were very high. It's very interesting because it was competitive and there were lots of firms. Even though the regulatory structure was very weak, the government of Bangladesh still has very poor governance. Vertical is always weak. The quality of medicines was controlled by horizontal checking. What do I mean by this? So suppose I am Square or I am Beximco, I am a Bangladeshi manufacturer. I don't want my brand name to be damaged by poor quality medicine. So these companies would send out armies of people into the markets looking for boxes which looked like their boxes but with one word, because to control fake medicine, they would detect any fake medicines. They would then use their political connections and their money to call the police, to call the Rapid Action Battalion or whoever, go to this market, pick up this medicine and burn it. Burn the warehouse. In other words, the horizontal checking ensured that good quality was maintained. People didn't die of, and the multinationals were waiting, right? There would be one accident, one incident where some poor quality medicine, and they will say, look, we told you, you can't have cheap medicines. Because they knew this, there was the pressure on them to make sure that this didn't happen. Ganashastro was also there. They therefore used vertical checks to make sure that the quality was maintained. They themselves had to raise their GMP. All because of incentives, right? The incentives were right. People can do it. If the incentives are right, you will pull back the person in the queue because you want the queue to hang. So we just have to make sure that the queue stands, right? You have to create the conditions where people in the queue will keep the queue going. And they knew that if they reduce their cost of production while maintaining GMP, GMP is good manufacturing practice in medicine, right? So there are some standard organizational procedures of how you do quality control and so on. And you have to learn this from more advanced pharmaceutical companies. So they went and bought this knowledge from the Europeans, from the Swiss, from the Indians and whoever. It wasn't free, but they were looking at the future profits. Okay, so the two factors that ensured the horizontal checks, one was that there were many companies, And two, that the multinationals were also watching them. They didn't want to give them an excuse to come back. And Ganashastro Kendro. That the Ganashastro Kendro, the social enterprise that was driving this, was also bringing in good manufacturing practices of its own. Productivity growth was high. They brought in a lot of these best practice. So the pharmaceutical companies were organized as pharmaceutical companies should be organized. And all that the state provided was basically the drug policy, the pricing rule, and regulatory support. And it began to invest in education and pharmacology because there was a growing demand of pharmacologists within the industry. Growth was extremely high. It's at more than 15% decade after decade. Exports are growing at 15% to a whole number of countries. There also have recently got regulatory approval to export to the US and Australia. You know, around 200 companies, domestic companies meet 98% of demand. So multinationals still haven't really come back in Bangladesh in a big way. All of this is really locally owned, domestically owned companies. As with the garments industry, local ownership is really important. I am actually not a believer in FDI-driven development in this low technology stuff. You want to fabricate chips and DRAM and disk drives, that's different. But you don't want FDI to make your mid technology or mid to high technology stuff. That should be domestic firms for the simple reason that replication will be much higher if they're domestic firms. And without replication, without imitation, you will not get clustering. Without clustering, you will not get growth. So it's very simple. It's not an ideological issue against FDI. And so this local ownership allowed imitation, the movement of staff, the spread of best practices, and the rest is history. It's still heavily dependent on imported APIs. 90% of APIs are still imported, but is growing. Now it's growing, and around 40 APIs are now manufactured in Bangladesh, and these pharmaceutical industries are now doing backward linkages into the API producing process. GK is still leading. They're still the biggest API producer in Bangladesh. And of course, other backward linkages to bottles, containers, and so on and so on. So there's a whole clustering of industry going on around that. The problems in the future are that the big pharmaceutical companies in Bangladesh are now becoming like the multinationals. They're trying to raise prices, and and a lot of my research now in Bangladesh is about how to break that collusion. And we are finding ways of how to, break that collusion of the 4 or 5 big pharmaceutical companies so that they don't capture the market. That's a different story. I just wanted to say how we got here. Okay, let me conclude with the last slide. The 2 examples from Bangladesh, and if I had time, I could go through the auto industry in India, pharma industry in India. That's part of my research work. Is very similar strategy. Build organizational capability first, profit later. State can't discipline. State is not interested in disciplining, but state can construct the policy structure which gives you that incentive to invest and reduces your risk. It will not happen just by leaving it to the market. These are not market-driven strategies. These are industrial policy strategies because someone paid for that the transfer of knowledge. But it's not the old policy of protection and subsidies and monitoring from above, because that vertical monitoring always fails in our country. The political settlement does not allow the disciplining of powerful people. And industrialists are powerful people. So in contrast, these out-of-the-box industrial policy designs, they provided high ex-post returns. You would make profit only if you became competitive. But if you became competitive, the policy would allow you enough profit to pay for your investment in the organizational learning. Right? So in that sense, society was covering you, but covering you in a very clever way. It was covering you in a way that you yourself had to discipline yourself. In our society, that's the only thing that works. No one can discipline anyone else. It's when we want to discipline ourselves, we discipline. And that reliance on horizontal checking has yielded very high returns. So thank you. I think that's the lesson. I think there are things that, by the way, even in Bangladesh, People don't think like this, right? I'm trying to explain to them how they succeeded. So, okay, thank you.